Welcome to another episode of Artist Spotlight, the podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Stringer, and today's guest is Walker Corl, a fascinating graphic designer, photographer, and just a guy that I'm really looking forward to talking to, and for all of you to have an opportunity to hear his backstory, what he does, how he does it, and that's what we've got ahead for us. As always, the podcast brought to you by your friends at the Maryland Photography Alliance. You can check out what they have going on online at mdphotoalliance.org. There's always contests and information, upcoming events. It's all available to you there, and I definitely encourage you to take a look when you can. So with that, I want to welcome my guest today, Walker Corl. Walker, thanks for spending some time with us.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch, for having me on. I'm excited to chat.
So, I became aware of Walker through his social media, and we will definitely give all that information out so listeners can check it out. And, one of the things that really struck me looking at your portraiture is the models look to me like maybe a combination of some that are professionals and then some that are maybe part-time professionals, and then maybe sometimes some that are amateurs. And so, I guess my first question is that an accurate take? And for those who are not full-time working models, maybe talk through how you interact to get people comfortable with being in front of the camera when that's not their full-time gig.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that is definitely a very accurate statement. A lot of my work that I do kind of with models is a lot of testing, kind of agency testing, and truthfully just like portfolio building. I think like, as photographers, like sometimes we see certain parts of what we do as like a hobby. And I think kind of how I keep, you know, passion or keep it as a hobby is kind of using my passion to like help other people. And I think, having a wide range of models just allows me to use kind of my skills and my passion to like somewhat help them as well, so for instance, I love helping people build their portfolios, models from, just starting out or potentially model who has a lot that just needs to update it. So kind of, you know, uh, having models, from all ranges. Yeah. And to your question of like how I interact with them, having models of all ranges just allows me, uh, particularly to kind of like hone my skills on how I give direction, how I talk to models, especially if I have a client, a brand or whatever, behind me, kind of, looking at images. It's nice to have that skill when I'm on set, actually for a paid gig, and I'm talking with models because sometimes I don't have control over what models the client picks. So sometimes you'll get super talented, super experienced models, and then sometimes you'll get ones that are like, hey, this is my niece, she's going to model for us today, so you never really know what type of model you're going to get when you walk on set. So kind of using the time that I do, with like agency testing or just somebody who hits me up on Instagram through DM, this allows me a wide range just to kind of like hone those skills of like talking to models and shooting with different types of models.
When you talk about, someone who's a professional working model from experience, they kind of know from, their history, most photographers like this angle. This angle elongates my leg. This angle elongates my neck. This angle does X, Y, and Z. Whereas, the amateur, even if they're there, so obviously they're up to do this. But what would you say the few things are that you often give in terms of advice for newer models as far as posing or just kind of relaxing to get them in the mindset of, hey, let's do this, let's have fun with this. I've done this before, I've directed models, let me kind of walk you through it to get you comfortable. What are some of those first few things that certainly a willing but an unfamiliar model to the ways of that? What's some advice you often have?
Yeah, I mean, It is funny because especially nowadays with like social media and in particular phones, I think a lot of people are so used to the selfie. And basically what the selfie offers is people to be able to look at themselves in the camera and kind of like adjust themselves, as they're looking at themselves in the phone, so kind of when you get these experienced people, they're kind of, that experience is kind of taken away if they get in front of the camera and they don't have that model experience. So for me, a big thing that I usually tell models is, especially when they don't have a lot of experience, is don't be afraid to take a bad photo. Especially nowadays when the digital age, we're not, people are still shooting film, but with film, you shoot, you don't really know what you're getting. With digital, I can shoot 1,000 photos and I just need five. So I think it's good to tell them that, to say, hey, I'm looking for the best images. You're going to take bad photos. We're going to take bad photos. I'm going to give you bad direction. I'm going to give you good direction. So don't worry about that. Because I feel like that's where that connect of like, people, they're using their selfie so they can see themselves. Um, you know, but when you kind of take that away, it just makes them a little bit more uncomfortable. So I think kind of bringing it down to a level of like, look, I know you can't see yourself right now, and I'm kind of giving you direction, but just know like we're gonna pick the best ones. You can take a bad photo. That's definitely a big thing that I try to tell. And then, on the same par as that is I do like to shoot tethered. So I will kind of give models an option to kind of see themselves as well. Or I'll take a few shots, let them take, stop, bring them over to the TV or whatever I'm tethered to, or the computer, and just kind of give them a look so they can see what they do. And that usually calms them down, to see like, oh, I love the way this looks, and then they feel a little bit more comfortable and confident, and then just giving them that, you know, like, look, this one is a bad photo, but this one is a good photo. So it's like that bad one, nobody's going to see that. The good photo people are going to see. So I think that usually like relaxes people a lot.
Well, and it sounds like what you're doing is you're educating them, and then you're helping to kind of instill confidence that even though they've just met you, you are a trusted collaborator. Nothing's going out that really doesn't look good. Not just that you think, the model thinks, but maybe the agency or the brand, and nobody wants to put something out that doesn't portray the person and their brand, the clothing, whatever it is, in its best light. It's funny you're talking about taking selfies. My issue is always if I'm taking a selfie, which isn't that often, but the question is, where exactly on my phone do I look? So it doesn't look like I'm looking off, into the distance. So I can definitely relate to the trials and tribulations of selfies, and some people definitely have it down, but I am not among them. So one question that I always ask is about origins. And, I
Right.
know that when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that you went to college in Savannah and you were getting involved in terms of design. So, maybe kind of talk about how you got started there, and then, how that led to where you are today.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, I mean, like you said at the top, my kind of trait or my degree is actually in graphic design. So that's always been a big passion of mine, kind of growing up. I kind of grew up in the age where, personal computers had just, basically just had the big boom, early 2000s era, and I was constantly on computers. And then, as the software started to come along, like Adobe and these types of editing software, even I forget what it was called, Painter or whatever it was, just these
At Corel,
artistic.
like Corel Painter.
Exactly, yeah. These kind of software, I would spend hours on them and just mess with them, figure out what you could do to them, and over the years they have developed, very well. I mean, I remember the first version of Adobe Photoshop where you click it and it takes 10 minutes for the software to boot up. It took forever. So it was, it was super fun doing that. And then ultimately that kind of led me into wanting to be a graphic designer. I remember, ripping magazines, apart, with ads and stuff. I was big into sports, so I would always have, Sports Illustrated or different catalogs. And for some reason, I was always drawn not to the articles in the magazines, but to the advertisements. And, that was a big part of my kind of like journey of getting into graphic design. And then, during college and everything, while I was kind of studying this and trying to put together my own designs, I realized that there were a ton of elements that kind of went into design, like not only typography and layout and everything, but also images, so that kind of started my journey on, okay, like what images can I use in my designs that make them feel more, cohesive or make them feel better, kind of creating these campaigns. So ultimately it was like, to begin with, it was, just grabbing anything I could find on Google, Google Images, but it was back then, it wasn't isn't what it is today, but back then trying to search and just find random things to kind of, create my own designs or somehow, poster designs or somehow like integrate those images into my designs. And then, ultimately that evolved into the realization like, wow, like maybe I can actually take my own photos and then integrate them into my designs. And that's kind of where that sparked of me, like the passion of photography, kind of using photography as a tool to then, help build my campaigns or my creatives that would, go into my designs. Um, so that was kind of the origin of me going from like graphic design into photography, and then ultimately um, my design work led me into the advertising industry. And then that has kind of like accumulated over the years of me kind of integrating both my um, design work and my, photography or production work, kind of together. Which is why me particular, even to this day, still love, kind of the agency, marketing and advertising world, which is where I do a lot of my client work.
It seems like a lot of the photographers that I know, especially a lot of the wildlife photographers and architecture photographers, they're also students of design. Some had art degrees in colleges and universities. And, when they're looking to compose an image, and they're looking for certain balance or symmetry in the image, they're kind of drawing on this understanding of design elements. And I have one dear friend of mine, and we'll walk around and he will look at rust accumulating on a metal garage door, and he'll say, that's like a Rothko. If you look up closely these patterns, and he and I'll walk through cities all around the world, and he'll reference artists, and his degree is in art, and damn if he isn't right, and part of his slideshows will be images of some of these great, painters and designers, and one of their images next to, the rusty wall that photo he took in somewhere. And, so I think that, for many photographers, an understanding of graphic design kind of informs their photography, and they're kind of, very, very linked, especially from a composition standpoint. So when you're shooting models, whether it's conscious or unconsciously, do you feel like that some of those design elements, even photographing a person and composing the image with a sense of balance, do you call on that graphic design background, or are you just kind of shooting the portrait on its own merit?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Like I think the greatest thing about design and photography is there's so much overlap of those like kind of visual elements that you're talking about, like balance and composition and color theory and all these different things that you can kind of integrate. both between graphic design and photography. And like, especially for me being more of a commercial photography, that has definitely helped my photography, the way I think about like my design of stuff, especially when I'm shooting, let's say a campaign for a brand, you know, right off the bat, like first what my mind goes to is how am I going to be using these images in design work or in, different materials? Is it going to be on a billboard? Is it going to be on a print ad? Is it going to be, social media? And then also the other elements of like, okay, is there text going to be on this image? Is it going to be over top? Am I going to create a spread? Like how are these different elements going to work into this image? And then, obviously the photography elements are a little bit more, like what is the campaign for? Is it a product I'm selling? Is it, a lifestyle, So those elements kind of will lead into the graphic elements as well. But you have an overall kind of art direction of what you're kind of creating. So it for me, like it has just always been a great balance of understanding design work and knowing, you know, how I need to shoot things to like complement the design, and I've even been told by, agencies that I've worked with the past, like, opposite agencies, like let's say I'm just taking the photos and then I'm sending them off to agencies. And I have been told like sometimes like they'll reach out to me, is like, hey, do you have like a design background? And I was like, yeah, I'm actually, a designer as well, so it is funny because like when I'm thinking about these things shooting, I know these images are going to be going to somebody with these skills as well. So I kind of have them in mind as well, of like, knowing, okay, if they need to add text in these parts, maybe I need to shift my composition, you know, in this way so I can like kind of compensate for those things that I know that they need to add later in post-production. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a benefit having kind of all these like little skills and tools that kind of like super mesh well together.
You're a double threat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know when I would work with editors and they'd say, we're looking for either a portrait or some sort of an image. It could even be an action photo, but we're looking for that for the cover. Then, I was very cognizant of leaving room at the top of the image for the magazine title, and then
Yeah.
often, down the left side for, whatever they needed to have. So yeah, definitely can relate to that. So when you're shooting, I know that you shoot stills, you also do video. So much has been made really by every manufacturer. It seems like that, this lens can shoot stills, it can shoot video, it can do your taxes. There's nothing this camera can't do. So, that said, someone who's a working professional like yourself, are you finding that these hybrid camera solutions on a professional level work? Or is it really at a professional level? I'm kind of emphasizing that you really want to have the best in class for stills, and maybe the best in class for video is not the same physical camera body that you use for stills, or are there ones that are just they work for both? They're good and you don't need a second system for video.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this question is super interesting for me because I am actually in this process of kind of switching from a like specific kind of like high-end stills camera to more of a hybrid system. And I think, yeah, ultimately because the times have pretty much they've changed. It's not that they're changing, like they've changed. Like being a hybrid shooter nowadays is almost a must. Not it doesn't have to be a must, but like I think most working professionals, especially with social media, because video is such a huge part of social media, like having that experience with video as well is just such a benefit. Like you almost kind of need it nowadays. But specifically to the gear, I mean, I will say I used to shoot with a Nikon D810, and most people say, these days, like the cameras are doing amazing things, like gear doesn't matter. For me, I necessarily don't agree with that because I do feel like there are like you're kind of paying for what you need or specific, specific things that you need. And ultimately with me, it was, with the Nikon D810, full frame camera, beautiful, beautiful images coming out of that camera. At the time, like that, I think that was one of Nikon's last kind of DSLR lines. That camera just wasn't up to par when it came to video, and knowing that the world was kind of switching, I felt like for me particularly, I needed to switch to something that was a little bit more, had great images, but also had, great, video quality as well. So for me, particularly like kind of looking into like those systems of what was kind of the best hybrid options. Sony was doing great stuff, Canon was doing great stuff, with both. I think, it is a tough question to answer too, because the Nikon images were great, just like as kind of a sole image camera, and that was what it was best at. It was best at taking photos. I have noticed for me, like switching more into a hybrid system, like both things, both images and video are amazing, but maybe you're losing a little bit of that kind of specific thing where, solely image camera, is focusing solely on that. But when you go into something that's focused more on image and video, maybe, you're losing a little bit something in the image department. Um, but also too, it's a part of the kind of uh way things have changed that, you know, there's not a lot of print being done, especially for someone in my position of, you know, shooting, um, more digital, social media kind of stuff now. So I'm not really shooting a lot of, magazine ad things anymore, not shooting a lot of billboard stuff. It's a lot more social media. And with that comes a lot of compression, comes a lot of, you know, resolution downgrades, basically, So you don't really need a lot of the like those megapixels anymore. You don't need cameras with, huge files, So especially for me, like I think most of my work now is on social media that when I take a photo with these hybrid systems, for me, the photo looks amazing pretty much anywhere. They still look great. Most cameras look amazing nowadays, but I don't need like these huge, megapixel files anymore to like do something for a billboard campaign or a, print ad, even though these, hybrid systems, they could still shoot those for sure, but maybe you're losing a little bit things here and there. But ultimately, you know, I think hybrid systems are for sure the future. Everything will be trying to stay on those levels of great image quality and great video quality.
As I see so many people, like we probably all do on YouTube and other places, where they want to take the latest camera and the lenses, and they want to do these, comparisons, and they say, this one at 2.8 and this one at 2.8, you can see which has more fall off towards the edges, etc. I suppose there's a place for that, but what I don't see most of the time from those very same people is them actually out working, making pictures. They spend more time photographing eye charts than they do actually using the equipment. And typically, they don't actually even own the equipment that they are so-called testing. So
Yeah,
getting caught up in how many megapixels and edge fall off and, all that kind of, the pixel peeping and everything else. I think that's, more of a scientific kind of point of interest than it is a practical making pictures kind of thing. And you said
for
it. I
sure.
mean, all the brands, really are pretty darn good today. And there's
Yeah,
always levels of good, and there's certain cachet with shooting with this camera versus the other, and that's fine. It motivates people to make different decisions, but so much of what we're seeing is ending up on somebody's phone, the iPad, or the computer, which is typically backlit. So it's going to make colors pop more than if you were looking at a picture on a wall or a billboard. And,
Yeah.
uh, we're consuming media differently than we did even 5 years ago. So, one that kind of leads me to an offshoot of what we're talking about, which is lighting. So when you're shooting and you're doing these model tests or you're doing actual shooting for a particular brand, whether it's for print or it's for social media, but stills I'm primarily talking about, what are you doing from a lighting perspective?
Yeah, I mean, so me specifically, I love lighting. Lighting is so much fun. I don't find myself being like super creative in a sense of using a bunch of different lights or like color lights or different things. For me, it's like, how can I manipulate the light in maybe a way that, other people don't or other people can't. And for me, I feel like it does sometimes it gives my images a little bit of like a difference,
Mhm.
where I'll be asked, kind of like, how did you like this? Like this looks interesting, like for me, like one of my favorite things to do is like, okay, I'm in a space, it's super dark, but I want something that looks like natural window light. How do I light this space so it looks like there's a huge window right here and it's just pumping in light, so like these are kind of the things that I think of. My beginning in kind of lighting was super, um how do I say it? Like, kind of the wrong way to go about it. I fell in love with lighting, like honestly, just like showing up to, I had a friend who had, some lighting, and I would just show up and just like practice or like, practice, but like goof off, And it was like back when a time when I had just kind of picked up a camera and I didn't know anything. I didn't know, what flash duration was or what, sync speeds were, with lighting. So, I was shooting, with my camera settings and I was just seeing, a black screen and I didn't know why. And, trying to fiddle with the settings and trying to understand what it was and ultimately just found out how to do it on accident, you
Mhm.
know? And then, back then, not really having like money to spend on modifiers or, spend money on good lights. So really, you would just find anything that had artificial light and you would see what you could do with it, whether it be, you know, coffee table lamps or like, large standing lamps or, even when I did have strobes, like how is a way that I can make this light soft without having a softbox? How can I make this hard, but I want to control it more? So, lighting for me is, and I will say this, like in an age like we were talking about earlier with the gear, like, everything looks great. There are so many camera brands out there who are killing it. They do have like their differences, but for the most part, they look great. Even our phones nowadays, the photos look amazing, So it is that kind of like idea of, that I don't know if it's a controversy, but like what is a photographer now? Like pretty much anybody is a photographer, like, and I know some photographers hate that of saying like, oh, like, people with phones who can take photos, like, oh, they're not photographers. But I mean, if you really think about it, like, why not? Why aren't they photographers? If you can take a photo, I feel like anybody really can take a photo. But I think ultimately how we separate ourselves as professionals is how we shape the light, how we create, our style within the image, and understanding composition and color and all these different things. And for me, I feel like specifically how I separate myself from someone who just has a phone taking a photo is how I use light, how we manipulate light. And, for me, that's just like the funnest part about it because ultimately it's like a big puzzle. Like, what emotions am I trying to, get from this shoot? Like, how do I want it to ultimately look? And then I take that idea and I say, okay, how do I need to manipulate light to achieve that goal? Um, so I don't know if I answered your full question,
Yeah,
but
no,
yeah,
no, I like it. It makes a lot of sense. I think probably the most straightforward clearest advice I ever got early on from a lighting perspective was take your light source off your camera. That was
Yeah.
like, like day one, because, otherwise, think about it. You have a camera with a pop-up flash. What do? You pop the flash up or it pops up automatically. Voila, you have flash. Now you also have a subject with, red eyes that looks like they're a demon. But, the idea of, take the flash off the camera and, for the love of God, put it to the side, left or right. Just get it off the camera. And that was, great advice. I think about people whose work I've seen, like Greg Gorman, who throughout his career, which continues today, always had sort of this classic Hollywood lighting. One of my previous guests, phenomenal photographer Jeff Lipsky, and Jeff said, he shows up to most shoots with a truck full of lighting because if he needs to turn nighttime into day or a sunny day into a cloudy day or cloudy into sunny or he has a great space, but he doesn't have great window light. He can create the illusion of great window light. And so, lighting when done well is just, there's nothing like it because as Jeff Lipsky put it, he's kind of a problem solver relative to what the client wants. And sometimes, you're in the right place, you've researched, you're at the right time, and natural light works because all the planets align, but the planets don't always align. That's why that phrase exists. So understanding what you need to do, what you want the result to be, and then having the resources there if you need them. I think that is part of what makes a professional photographer a professional and a person who, hopes that the picture works out, a photographer. You can't hope when you're being paid. You have to know. And I think that there's a difference in there probably.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Like, for me specifically, especially when I walk into a space, I think a lot of people, especially I know in like cinematography, a lot of people, worry about what the available light is doing first. And I think for me too, I kind of bring that in my photography of like, okay, I walk into a space, first off, what is the available light doing? If I do have a window, what does it look like if I'm closer to the window, if I'm further away from the window? If I'm, let's say the space doesn't have a window and it has an ugly, tungsten, light above, halogen light, above, like, all right, like I don't want to use that, or I do want to use that, turn it off. Okay. Like, all right, once it's pitch black, like let's start adding lights now, and for me, yeah, like I do like to limit myself because I can get carried away sometimes with lighting, so having a truckload of toys like sometimes is a little bit overwhelming because I'm like, oh, like yeah, I can do this, this, and this with the light. For me, like I try to, especially when I'm going on set, I'll take a few lights, probably usually travel with about three, but always, always, always start with one, trying to figure out how can I do this with one light? Okay. And then if I need more, I can add more, but I think for the most part, most of my studio setups, I usually can achieve with one light, and I'm usually happy with that. Um, but like back to your point, earlier point, like I had a professor too who told me uh pretty much like kind of how you master light is when you can use light in a way where it was not meant to be used. I think that was the quote he said. And what I mean by that is using light in a way that necessarily, you know, when we think about light, we think about, oh, okay, shooting it directly at a person or putting a modifier over it that we have like gear, but for me, like it's always interesting to like kind of manipulate light in a way of like, okay, like when I walk into a space and I look and I see like, oh, okay, like this wall over here is painted black, but that wall over there is painted white. So I wonder if I walk over there and take a light and I turn the light directly into that white wall, and then I know once it hits that white wall and it returns back into my model's face, I know it's going to be softer, you know? So if I back the light away from it and I turn up the power, so it's hitting more of the wall, Now I know the light's going to be even softer. If I take that light and I move it super close to the wall and I shoot and it's just hitting kind of like a little circle on it, I know it's going to be somewhat soft, but it's going to be a little bit more controlled. It's going to be a little bit more, you know, a little bit more contrasty. So I mean, like kind of like manipulating lights in ways that necessarily, you know, we don't typically use, like we would just like turn a light to somebody and fire, with this, like using things around you that can ultimately like help you achieve to use like achieve the ultimate image that you're trying to get.
So you, in your work, whether it's one light or more, you're working with maybe reflectors or at least bouncing light a lot to soften it, or kind of spread the light a little bit, which softens it essentially. Does that
Yeah, for sure. Like for me specifically, I think, you know, when I'm trying to shoot something like daylight, and I don't have a window, if I want something that looks like daylight, I immediately think, okay, like what does a window actually do? Like what is its purpose? And I know a window basically is on a wall and it's a hole in the wall. And what that hole in the wall is doing is it's letting light in, softly, from like this hole in the wall. So if I want to like kind of create that same effect, I think, okay, well, if I turn a light towards a wall and I shoot it and I hit kind of like the same space of where a window would be and it returns that light, ultimately it's going to kind of look like a window. And then obviously, you can manipulate windows with curtains, or you can manipulate them, or you can just have direct light coming in. Or if you have blinds, you can have textures, and nowadays we have gobos or attachments, different things we can put on lights to kind of give us these effects or these patterns of blinds or whatever. So I mean, there are different ways that you can manipulate the light to kind of ultimately look like natural window light. You just kind of have to play around with the light and kind of figure out. And me particular, like especially because I do a lot of shooting, at a home. I do a lot of like testing at a home studio, and my space necessarily isn't big, so I do have a window in that space, but sometimes it's rainy outside and I don't get a lot of sunlight. Sometimes like I'm getting direct sunlight and it's too much. So in those situations as well, I can manipulate, with a curtain, or if it's too dark outside, then I can bring out a light, and I can recreate that light with a strobe.
Well, and I was going to ask you, and this is maybe a good way to kind of walk listeners through it. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking about it in kind of phrasing it as the anatomy of a photo shoot. So, when you have an assignment that someone has hired you to shoot, are you working with the brand to develop a storyboard of images or a shot list, or are they typically coming to you with that list? And then another maybe question we can weave in there is, if they're trying to create a mood, and so many products today, it's not just about that product, it's about a lifestyle. Everything from a shirt to a cup of coffee to a screwdriver apparently now brings with it not just that item, but an entire lifestyle. So that involves the environment in which that model or models are being shot. And then, of course, you have the selection of the models. So maybe, if we could walk through from kind of concept through, execution, finalization of that, because it doesn't happen in a day, it doesn't happen in a week, and it's a number of people involved in that process. So maybe shed some light, peel back the curtain for those who haven't, done a commercial photo shoot, on what that looks like, what the timeline looks like from, XYZ brand wants to hire you for their summer catalog. Okay, and now this begins. Kind of let people know what that looks like.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as most people would know, like every client is different. So when you get first contacted, you don't ultimately know what you're going to get. Most of the time, it's the generic idea of, this is what we need, maybe here are a few Pinterest images that we've found that kind of gives you a direction. And then some clients, have everything laid out. Oh, we want this like this specifically, we want this color background, or we rented a location and we're going to shoot at this house or we're going to shoot at this park, you know. So, it always depends on what it is. And I think going back to like kind of my advertising experience, it definitely, the concepting part is something that I love, and something that I do, have a lot of experience in, because I have worked on the agency side as well as like working with a photographer, but also being the photographer and working with an agency or with a brand. Um, so yeah, I mean, ultimately that first call is just to understand what they're trying to accomplish. Sometimes it's as easy as, they just want, kind of catalog photos or e-commerce photos of just like, white background, simple, natural looking light. They just want to highlight the clothing that the model is wearing, or, something like that. And then you have other brands who, have a specific product and they want to make sure that that product is being used in the situation that it needs to be used. For instance, a blender, like, obviously maybe you want to, find a nice kitchen, so you can, have a model actually using it how it's supposed to be used. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's usually like the first stage, is like understanding like what they ultimately want to get out. And sometimes it's a variation of all of those things, of just like simple product photography on like a white background, and then want it to be used in a space that the product is actually being used in. Um, so then understanding that, it's almost like moving into, or at least what I do is understanding what we want to shoot, and then understanding where it needs to be used. So if it is being used for social media, if it is a print ad or something else like that, how do we need to shoot this? Is it, 9:16 crop? Is it 4:5 crop? Is it, landscape? Is it portrait? Understanding those things will help understand how we create the advertising at the end, or whatever the final kind of work is. And then understanding, again, like where it will be used, if it's going to be on a website, or if it's going to be a magazine, or if it's all of the above. Yeah, and then from that, kind of understanding what the deliverables are. If it's a model, are we doing retouching? Are we, you know multiple crops? How many final images are you looking to get out of it? Is another process. And then ultimately going from understanding what the project is to pre-production, which is more of just like, what gear am I going to use? What's the location? Can we do a tech scout? Can we go and figure it out, so I can figure out, okay, how do I need to set up lighting? Do I have natural lighting? Understanding all that to then move into the actual production. Production kind of goes from there, of what you're, basically what you're shooting, to get all of the things that you previously figured out, all the images, and then post-production, and then to ultimately to publish.
So when the result of a shoot is 5 or 6 images, I mean, it could be weeks or months of legwork to get ultimately to those 5 or 6 images, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's one, I mean, especially, you know, this is a more specific, example, but working with like a celebrity, maybe you just have, 5 minutes with them and you need to get like a portrait, or maybe they're coming to set and actually, doing a brand deal or something, and you have to shoot them with the product. Um, so, sometimes on the day you don't really know what you're going to get, which is interesting. Um, so you can't really plan any of the pre-production stuff. Um, and you just try to get what you can get. Sometimes I've actually been on set before where the purpose of the shoot was actually for video or like a commercial spot, but then I'm there with my camera as a photographer. And once they call cut and they're like, okay, reset the camera, we're moving to a different location in the house or whatever, I'll jump in real quick and I'll tell the talent like, hey, stay right here for a second. I just want to take a couple photos, and then I'll kind of hop in and do that. So sometimes you kind of have to work around a production um, to uh, to get the images as well that you need. Or even sometimes, some directors are cool if they're like actually shooting and you're just like standing behind by, a cam, and you're just kind of, firing off, some photos on silent mode, obviously, because you can't screw up the audio. Been yelled at a few times about that, um, but yeah, I mean, a lot of different projects are, you never really know what you're going to get, and sometimes, yeah, like clients want every photo that you've taken, and sometimes client just want five that they select at the end of it. So just depends on the project.
I'll tell you, with today's electronic shutters, it makes it so much easier than back in the day when you had to have the blimp and all that to deaden the sound, and
Yeah.
it's a whole production. So let me ask you this, and we could sort of call this like advice corner. So for those people who are listening who say, I've been taking pictures for years, or I want to get into photography, and whether it's family or friends or whatever, how can I make better portraits of people that I want to make, whether it's my kids, my grandkids, my partner, my friends? What's a couple of nuggets of advice from a commercial photographer uh, to one, kind of make the photographer relax and know that, everything's going to be fine, but then they can kind of convey that, sense of confidence to whoever it is they're photographing. Do you have any thoughts for the amateur around portrait photography and, making it seem like not such a daunting task?
Yeah, I mean, the advice I always give, and I feel like this is kind of not dumb advice, but it's very kind of um oh, what's the term?
Sort of like
It's just
basic.
like, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of like basic knowledge is like, for me, how I approach shooting with models or shooting, kind of portrait is ultimately like your end goal with that. Obviously depending on if you're shooting for a client or something, but ultimately it's just to make them look their best. I feel like a lot of times photographers get so caught up in like concepts and so caught up in composition and all of these different things that we're taught as like, design elements or technical like kind of standpoints, that we kind of forget to just make the person look good. Do what you can to make them look their best. And if that is, giving them a little bit more direction, to move their head a certain way, or, pick up their shoulders, or even like for me too, like, especially when I see people a little bit stressed, when we're taking, um, portraits, I'll just be like, pull the camera aside real quick and just tell the person, hey, deep breath, breathe in and then breathe out and sit into it. Like, so kind of that. And then once they kind of come down, it's kind of their natural state of them just sitting into the way that they will sit. Because a lot of people, especially if they're not used to being in front of a camera, they almost like, when you tell them to be natural, they almost like they try to act what they think natural is.
Sure.
And like, that's the opposite of what I want. Like, when I say be natural, I say just be you. And most of the time too, that's even when you're just like talking to people, like sometimes like, because like me in particular, like I like when people stand the way that they stand, and I know that that's kind of weird, but when you tell people to stand, they usually stand like awkward or something, like a way that they would never
Very
stand.
stiff.
Yeah, or sit. When you say sit the way you sit. And sometimes even during like, what I'll do is I'll even just like put down the camera real quick and just have like a quick like random conversation about something. It doesn't even have to be about photography or whatever, even if it's just like a second for them to like relax. And then all of a sudden what you'll see them do is you'll see them relax into a natural state. And ultimately, what that is whether that is like them standing a way that they usually stand, like if they, let's say they shift their weight to a hip or they shift their weight to a leg, you know, or if they stick their hands in their pockets, or if they, hold their hands together in an interesting way. And what I'll do is like I'm talking to them, but I'm watching their body language. I'm watching to see how they're like naturally moving. And once I see something that's like that's natural to them, and I know that that's natural to them because I didn't tell them to stand that way, they're just naturally doing it. And then what I'll do is I'll stop the conversation and I'll say, okay, don't move, look at your figure right now. Like, look at yourself right now in this state. This is you completely naturally relaxed. And this is the way that I want you to be. Especially with like sitting or something, or even how they fold their hands in front of themselves. Some people do like the pray hands, or some people will interlock their fingers, or some people will just like kind of like I don't know, like fold their hands in weird ways. And once you see them kind of do that, you know that that's natural to them. And I'll stop them and I'll be like, okay, like look at your hands right now. You see how they're folded? This is naturally how you fold your hands. And these are things, these micro things that we necessarily don't think about. Our body just does it because we're in like a natural state. Even the way we smile, sometimes when you tell people to smile, you get a big cheese, kind of like just teeth and everything smile. But when I tell people, okay, like, or I'll say a joke or something, I'll say, something dumb, and they'll start laughing, and I'll be like, okay, did you just feel that? Like how you smiled right now? Like your teeth weren't like clenched together when you actually naturally smiled. You actually like they were separated a bit. You felt that? Like that's what I want. I ultimately want you to uh, you know, be in a natural state. I don't want you to like think about smiling. I just want you to smile. So these are like little tricks that like I have a bunch of like little tricks and stuff that I do to try to like get those like little things. And that ultimately just like makes portraiture more natural, and makes them look their best, their natural way, you know. So those are like little t tips and tricks that I do for like portrait. And I have like tons of those little things, but those are like main ones that I usually use.
Well, I think that's great. It makes sense to me because you're in a way you're kind of giving them permission just to be themselves and not have to be someone else for this photo. Just be yourself. That's all we want to do is capture your picture, not you being someone else or acting another way. So that's great advice. Well, Walker, so I know that, following the publication of this podcast, people are going to want to check out your work. Where are the best places or the best place where people can see what you're doing and take a look at your work?
Yeah, I mean, most of my kind of just specific photography work, I use, Instagram a lot. So it's just my name at Walker Corl, Corl. Um, And I have a website or kind of freelance stuff that I do sometimes. My kind of what do you call it, self brand is Crawler. Kind of playing off my name, Walker and Crawler. And also it was a kind of just a funny nickname kind of growing up. So I kind of turned it into kind of this, kind of freelance kind of brand that I use. So that website is iamcrawler.com, where I put some of, my more professional work and stuff that I have, or client work on that. But most of my just like kind of everyday, you know, test shoot, model photography, or just like daily stuff I post on Instagram.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. Your story, your backstory is fantastic, and the work you do is terrific. So, thanks for joining us, and thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate it. Had a lot of fun.
Well, I invite everybody to join us on the next episode of Artist Spotlight, the podcast. Until then, I'm Mitch Stringer wishing you good light, happy shooting. You can check out what I have going on my Instagram at Mitch Stringer Images, and of course online at mitchstringerimages.com. We'll see you next time.